Welcome to the deep dive, where we take all your sources and kind of pull out the most fascinating nuggets of knowledge. Today, we're exploring this interesting thing, the paradox of rationality. Our main source is this really insightful interview with Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins, two really big thinkers, I think you'd agree. And we'll be kind of tackling the question of why humans who are capable of incredible feats of rationality, like scientific discoveries and technological advancements, also fall prey to all these biases and irrational beliefs. So we'll be talking about things like the myside bias and judging historical figures and the dangers of echo chambers, all pulled from what Pinker and Dawkins shared in this interview.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating paradox. Like, on one hand, we have the capacity for logic and reason and scientific inquiry, but then on the other hand, we see, all these examples of superstition and conspiracy theories and decisions made totally based on emotion.
So how do we make sense of these two sides of human nature? It seems contradictory, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Pinker starts by defining rationality as the use of knowledge to attain a goal.
Mm.
So that sounds simple enough, right?
Yeah, it does. But Dawkins brings up a really interesting point that the goal itself could be anything, right? So rationality can be used for good or evil.
Oh, that's a good point.
Like, think about it. If someone's meticulously planning a bank heist, that requires a lot of rationality, but it's definitely not, a positive thing for everybody.
That's kind of a chilling thought.
That
So
is.
rationality itself is neutral. It's the goal that decides whether it's good or bad.
Exactly.
And that actually kind of leads us into one of the more fascinating and honestly kind of depressing concepts in this interview.
Yeah.
The my side bias.
Yeah. The myside bias is this, it's everywhere, this cognitive bias that makes us favor information that already lines up with what we believe, even when there's evidence that says otherwise. It's like we're wearing these mental blinders that block out anything that challenges the way we see the world.
Yeah, it's like we just don't want to see things that we don't want to see.
Right.
They gave a really interesting example uh, about gun control and skin cream. Do you remember that?
Yeah. So in this study, there were these two groups of people. They each had pretty strong views on gun control, and they were shown statistical data that they had to analyze. But here's the really interesting thing. The researchers were clever. They disguised the same data. They presented it as gun control information to one group, and to the other group, they presented it as if it was about like how effective a skin cream was.
So same data, but presented in two different ways. So what happened?
Well, the results were pretty wild. When the data was framed in terms of like a neutral topic like skin cream, both groups could analyze it rationally and they actually came to the right conclusions. But when the data was about gun control, well, their critical thinking kind of went out the window.
Really?
Yeah, they were way more likely to misinterpret the data in a way that just backed up what they already believed about gun control.
It's almost like they were so emotionally invested in the topic that it just stopped them from seeing the facts clearly, right?
Yeah, exactly. This study shows how deep this my-side bias goes and how hard it is to fight, even for people who are smart and well-informed.
Yeah, and what's worse is even Pinker admitted that he struggles with this bias. He said he prefers editorials that fit his own views. He actually joked that he sometimes feels like he has to fact-check articles he agrees with even harder just to balance out that bias.
It's kind of humbling. Even those who advocate for logic and critical thinking, even they can fall into these cognitive traps.
I think it's a good reminder that we all have these biases. It's a part of being human. But Pinker and Dawkins didn't leave us hanging with just our flaws. They also talked about how we can use reason to overcome our limitations. They discussed this old debate between uh, empiricism, which is learning from experience, and rationalism, relying on logic and reason.
Yeah, they said that both approaches are important. Like, it's not about choosing one over the other. It's more about recognizing the value of each and finding a way to use them together.
So we shouldn't ditch logic and reason totally in favor of just going with our gut. But we also shouldn't get so lost in abstract thinking that we forget about the real world.
Yeah, exactly. We need a good balance. And to illustrate this, they talked about a really relevant example, the whole attempt to cancel David Hume, the famous Enlightenment philosopher.
That David Hume controversy.
No.
It was a stark reminder of how tricky it is to judge people from the past by today's standards.
For sure. Hume, even though he was brilliant and contributed so much to philosophy, he also, he expressed some views that we consider really offensive today. So some people wanted to remove his name from buildings and institutions. They wanted to, like, erase him from history. But Pinker argued against this, saying that it's important to consider the historical context.
Yeah, his point was that we can't just take our current morals and force them onto people who lived in totally different times with different social norms. And if we really think about that, it leads to some pretty uncomfortable questions about our own beliefs and actions, like what things that we consider normal now will future generations see as totally barbaric or wrong.
Right.
It's a bit humbling, right?
It is.
It definitely makes you think twice before joining in on the outrage mob. So we've talked about being more nuanced and thoughtful in our judgments, but how do we actually make more rational decisions in such a complicated world? Well, Pinker and Dawkins introduced this powerful tool for navigating this, Bayesian reasoning.
Yeah, Bayesian reasoning is a way to update what we believe based on new evidence. It's like taking both our existing knowledge and new information and using them to get a more accurate picture of the world.
It sounds complicated, but I think they explained it pretty clearly.
The main idea is you start with a prior belief. That's your starting point for something. Then you run into some new evidence, and based on how likely that evidence is to be true and how strong it is, you adjust your original belief. It's a constant process of getting closer and closer to the truth.
Okay, that makes sense. They use that great example of a medical diagnosis, right? Like, let's say a woman takes a test for breast cancer, and the result is positive. The test is very accurate. Let's say it's 90% accurate. Does that mean there's a 90% chance she has breast cancer?
Well, not necessarily. This is where that Bayesian reasoning comes in. We
Yeah.
have to think about not just how accurate the test is, but also the base rate. That's how common breast cancer is in the general population. If the base rate is low, let's say like 1%, then even a really accurate test can give you a bunch of false positives.
Right.
And it turns out that in that example, her actual chance of having breast cancer is closer to 10%, not 90%. It seems kind of crazy, but it really shows you how important it is to think about those base rates when you're looking at statistics.
So even doctors who are trained in statistics and probability can fall for this base rate neglect thing, and that could lead to, wrong diagnoses and treatment decisions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this isn't just about medical stuff either. Base rate neglect can mess with our judgment in all sorts of situations, like when you're figuring out how risky an investment is or how likely something is to happen.
It just shows how important it is to really understand statistics and be aware of those mental shortcuts our brains take. But let's move on to another interesting tool for making decisions when things are uncertain. Signal detection theory.
Yeah, signal detection theory helps us figure out how we make choices when we don't have all the information. It acknowledges that we're often stuck making judgments based on incomplete or fuzzy data. We have to weigh the potential costs and benefits of different outcomes.
It's like trying to pick out a quiet voice in a noisy room. You can't really tell if it's a real signal or just all the background chatter.
Exactly. And the consequences can be serious, especially in things like medical diagnoses or legal cases. Pinker talked about this interesting example from the legal world Blackstone's ratio. It basically says that it's better to let 10 guilty people walk free than to wrongly convict one innocent person.
So it emphasizes the importance of avoiding those false positives, even if it might mean letting some guilty people get away.
Right. But it also raises some big questions about values, like how do we balance the need for justice with the need to protect innocent people? Where do we draw the line?
And this ties into a very relevant and controversial topic, the standard of proof in sexual assault cases on college campuses. Some people think we should lower the standard to make it easier to convict attackers, while others say that would lead to way more false convictions, which would be devastating for innocent people.
Yeah, it's complicated with no easy answers. Signal detection theory helps us see the inherent trade-offs when making decisions in uncertain situations. But in the end, it's up to society to decide how much risk we're willing to accept.
So we've explored some tools and ways of thinking for rational decision-making. But what about those built-in biases we have? Are we just doomed to be ruled by our irrational impulses? Pinker didn't seem to think so. He had this interesting idea that humans actually evolved as intuitive lawyers rather than intuitive scientists.
That's a cool way to look at it. We're wired to be persuasive to argue our case to win, even if it means stretching the truth a bit.
So instead of objectively weighing evidence and looking for the truth, we're more like salespeople, pitching our own beliefs and ideas, even if they're not the best ones out there.
That's a perfect analogy, and it explains why we fall for things like confirmation bias and other mental shortcuts. We're not naturally inclined to be impartial judges of information. We're like lawyers for our own beliefs.
But if we're all naturally biased, is there any hope for rationality?
Pinker said that even though we're prone to bias, we can create institutions and practices that help us overcome those limitations and get closer to being objective.
So it's not about getting rid of bias completely, which might be impossible, but about creating systems that minimize its influence.
Right, and he pointed to science as a great example.
Hmm.
The scientific method, with all its peer review and replication and rigorous testing, is designed to filter out bias and bring us closer to the truth.
And having a free and independent press is super important too. Journalists who fact-check and present different sides of the story and hold powerful people accountable. They play a huge role in promoting rational conversations.
These institutions act like safeguards, helping to keep us rooted in reality, even when our gut feelings might steer us wrong.
So it's not just about being rational as individuals, but also about creating a social and cultural environment that supports and encourages rational thought and behavior. And that brings us to Pinker and Dawkins' discussion about Neil deGrasse Tyson's idea of rationalia, a made-up country where all policies are based on evidence and reason.
Sounds like a dream come true for people who love logic and rationality. But Pinker and Dawkins pointed out some potential problems with that idea.
Yeah, you can't just use evidence to figure out our goals or values. Even in a perfectly rational society, you'd still have arguments about what's important ethical considerations and how to distribute resources.
Exactly. Even if everyone agrees on the facts, there can still be totally valid disagreements about what to do with those facts.
And they connected this to what's going on in politics today, where we're seeing more anti-rationality, people not trusting experts and rejecting scientific consensus.
Which is really worrying. The erosion of trust in institutions that promote rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making is a big threat to democracy and progress.
So we need to be careful to protect these institutions and promote a culture of critical thinking. But where do we go from here? How can we as individuals help build a more rational society, even with all our inherent biases?
That's the big question, and I think Pinker and Dawkins gave us some valuable ideas. We can start by being more aware of our own biases, recognizing that we're not immune to motivated reasoning and confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's like that saying, the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem.
Mm.
We need to admit that we all cherry-pick evidence and ignore information that challenges our beliefs.
Totally. Once you see your own weaknesses, you can start finding ways to counteract them. Like, try to get different viewpoints. Don't just surround yourself with people who agree with you all the time.
Yeah, it's easy to stay in our little echo chambers, but that can be dangerous. We need to be challenged and have our assumptions questioned.
Right. And don't just passively take in information. Be an active listener. Ask questions. Look for evidence. Think critically about where your information is coming from.
It's like being a detective, following the clues and trying to find the most likely explanation.
Exactly. And if something seems off, fact check it. There are great resources out there to help you figure out if something's true or not and spot misinformation.
Websites like Snopes and PolitiFact are like truth-seeking superheroes fighting against fake news and propaganda.
They're crucial in helping us make the world more rational. And hey, let's not forget about humor.
Oh yeah, Pinker definitely made us laugh a few times during the interview. It's like he was saying, this stuff is serious, but we don't have to be serious all the time.
Right. Humor can help break down defensiveness, make complicated things easier to understand, and remind us not to take ourselves too seriously.
Speaking of not taking ourselves too seriously, Pinker shared some really funny fake news headlines.
Oh yeah, the one about the woman who sued Samsung because her phone got stuck? Well, let's just say it wasn't in her pocket.
It's amazing that people actually fall for those crazy stories, but it just shows how easily misinformation can spread, especially when it plays on our emotions or fits with what we already believe.
We all love a good story, even if it's not true. That's why critical thinking is so important. We need to be able to step back and ask, does this really make sense?
Yeah, we need to develop our inner BS detectors. We all have them, but sometimes they need a little tune-up.
For sure. And remember, becoming more rational is a journey, not a destination. We're all constantly learning and changing.
So how do we stay on the right path and not get lost in irrationality? What advice would you give to our listeners who want to be more rational thinkers?
I think one of the most important things is to be humble. Realize that you don't know everything, that you can make mistakes, and that you're always learning.
It's like admitting that our understanding of the world is always incomplete and that we need to be open to changing our minds.
Exactly. Be willing to change your mind. Don't cling so tightly to your belief that you refuse to update them when new evidence comes along.
That's a tough one. It's hard to let go of beliefs we've held for a long time, even when the facts say we're wrong.
It is, but it's also a sign of intellectual maturity. Being able to change your mind and admit when you're wrong is a good thing, not a bad thing.
So instead of being stubborn and defending our views no matter what, we should be more like scientists, ready to revise our ideas as new data comes in.
Right. Embrace uncertainty. The world is complicated and there aren't always simple answers.
It's okay to say, I don't know, or I need more information. In fact, those are often the most rational responses.
Absolutely. And remember, rationality isn't just about cold logic, it's also about empathy, understanding different perspectives, and being open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
Like that Voltaire quote, judge a man by his questions rather than his answers.
Yes, a true rational thinker is curious, always asking questions and wanting to learn and grow. And that's a journey that's challenging, but really rewarding.
It sounds like we need to be more mindful of the environments we create, both online and offline. If we want to encourage rationality, we need to build places where open-mindedness and critical thinking can thrive.
That's a great point. We've talked about the importance of things like a free press and scientific communities, but it goes further than that. We need a culture of curiosity where people feel comfortable asking questions and challenging the way things are.
Like creating a space where different perspectives can mix and new ideas can grow.
Exactly. And that means changing how we think, from seeing disagreement as a bad thing to seeing it as a chance to learn and grow.
Pinker talked that we're all naturally like intuitive lawyers, but maybe we need to learn to be more like intuitive scientists.
I love that. It's about looking at the world with a sense of wonder, a desire to understand, and a willingness to be proven wrong.
It's like trading in our lawyerly briefcases for lab coats and microscopes.
And maybe a good dose of skepticism, too. Remember, if you're making a big claim, you need big evidence to back it up.
Carl Sagan would be proud. It all boils down to that basic principle of rationality, adjusting what we believe based on the evidence.
And recognizing that evidence isn't always crystal clear, we have to be comfortable with not knowing everything for sure, with weighing probabilities and making decisions based on the best information we have, even when it's incomplete.
It's like we're all playing a giant game of Bayesian poker, constantly adjusting our bets as new cards are dealt.
And sometimes we have to fold, even when we really want to stay in the game. Admitting we're wrong is a strength, not a weakness.
So what's the main takeaway from all of this? What do you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive into rationality?
That rationality is a superpower. It's the ability to use knowledge to reach our goals, make better choices, understand the world, and create a fairer and more humane society.
But it's a superpower that needs constant practice, improvement, and attention. We have to watch out for our biases, seek out different viewpoints, and be willing to change our minds.
And most importantly, we have to remember that rationality is a team effort. It's about creating environments where critical thinking can thrive, where evidence matters more than opinions, and where we can all learn and grow together.
So let's raise a toast for rationality, to embracing the messy, challenging, and ultimately fulfilling journey of becoming more thoughtful, informed, and rational people.
Cheers to that, and to never stopping asking questions, seeking truth, and trying to make the world a little bit better, one rational decision at a time.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the paradox of rationality. We hope you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking. Remember, becoming more rational is an ongoing journey, and we can all contribute to creating a more rational world. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep those minds sharp and those critical thinking skills honed.